As the weeks rolled into months, the neighborhood that had once been a minefield of tension began to transform into something it hadn't been in years. Normal, not perfect, not without the occasional parking squabble or leaf blower dispute, but peaceful in the way that matters most. The kind of peace where porch lights glow with welcome instead of suspicion, where kids laugh freely in driveways, and where neighbors nod to each other with something more genuine than politeness. Respite. The changes weren't loud or flashy, no big speeches were made, but lawn chairs appeared again on front porches, sidewalk chalk art returned, and the park hosted its first Easter egg hunt in 4 years. Behind much of this quiet restoration was Emily Foster, though she never claimed credit and often deflected thanks with a simple smile and a "just doing my part." She declined every media interview that still trickled in from the national attention. She turned down offers to speak at conferences, lead policy committees, or accept civic awards. She wasn't in this for recognition. She was in it because it was right. When the city council passed new HOA reform legislation requiring financial transparency, resident voting rights on major expenditures, and annual audits, Emily gave no comment, even though much of the bill's language had been modeled after the chaos her neighborhood had survived. One clause in the new law informally became known as Foster's Standard, a requirement that any HOA leader found guilty of abusing enforcement power would be permanently banned from any related public or private community leadership roles. And still, Emily never mentioned it. She was too busy mentoring rookie officers, expanding mental health response protocols at the precinct, and leading jogs through the neighborhood every morning with her same calm stride and sidearm at her hip. Then, one afternoon, she received a quiet call from the district attorney's office. Meredith Franklin had accepted a plea deal. She would avoid prison by agreeing to cooperate fully with the state's investigation into HOA corruption and abuse across other neighborhoods she had advised. Yes, Meredith had apparently been on several advisory boards, peddling her manipulative blueprint to other HOA boards in neighboring cities. Part of her plea included handing over all documents, emails, and chat logs related to these activities. In exchange, she would be permanently barred from holding any public, civic, or homeowners association-related position for life. Her name was added to a statewide civic ban list, alongside those convicted of election fraud and public fund misuse. Emily listened quietly, nodded once, thanked the caller, and hung up. She didn't smile or celebrate. But later that evening, as we sat on the porch, I noticed something in her expression I hadn't seen in a long time. Stillness. Not relief. Not triumph. Just peace. Meredith would never knock on anyone's door again. She wouldn't find a single person send an angry newsletter or weaponize a neighborhood's fear for her own ego. And yet, as the quiet settled in, one more envelope arrived. Small, white, plain, no return address. Inside, an itemized asset list showing what had been sold to pay restitution. Household items, furniture, appliances, and at the bottom, a line that simply read, "Drone damaged, returned with regret." Attached was a sticky note, shaky handwriting, unsigned, but unmistakably hers. "I didn't realize how far I was going. I felt threatened by your calm. I'm sorry." It wasn't redemption, but it was something. Emily read it once, folded it, and slipped it into the back of her old journal. She didn't speak about it. She just got up and resumed her day. That weekend, the new HOA leadership held a small ribbon-cutting ceremony at the old enforcement office, now redesigned into a peaceful community resource hub. Emily was invited to cut the ribbon but chose to stand quietly at the back, just another neighbor in the crowd. Afterward, a boy she had once helped find his lost puppy handed her a thank you card. Inside was a crayon drawing of a woman in a police uniform, standing between two houses with hearts overhead. It simply read, "You made everything better." Emily gave him a soft high five and told him to stay brave. In the weeks that followed, more neighborhoods reached out for guidance. Not through the city, but from within residents who had heard the story and wanted to know how to stop power-hungry. Board presidents in their own communities. A small network began forming. Quietly, organically shared spreadsheets, templates for fair policies, resources for legal recourse. Emily helped where she could, never stepping into the spotlight, just passing along what she knew. And slowly, a movement grew, not against HOAs, but for fairness, for accountability, for neighborhoods that felt like home again. 1 year to the day after Meredith's infamous 911 call, our block held a cookout. No flyers, no hidden agendas, just neighbors, music, and laughter. Someone brought out a Bluetooth speaker and played a classic rock song that had become something of an anthem during our rebuilding. Emily and I sat on the porch, watching kids run barefoot through sprinklers while parents sipped iced tea and waved at each other across driveways. And when the sun dipped low and the streetlights clicked on, I turned to her and said, "Do you realize what you did here?" She shook her head, smiling slightly. "I didn't do anything. We did. I just stood still when someone tried to push." I thought about that long after the night ended, and even now I still believe it's the best way to describe everything. She didn't fight back with rage or power. She didn't try to win through force. She just stood still, firm, calm, unmovable. And when the chaos finally collapsed, it did so against a wall that wouldn't crack. In doing so, she didn't just protect herself, she protected us all. The neighborhood didn't just survive Meredith, it found its voice because one woman refused to lose hers. Just when the community thought the chaos had finally subsided, and the neighborhood could start healing from Meredith Franklin's oppressive reign, a final, almost absurd chapter unfolded. The city council, driven by the overwhelming public response to Meredith's misconduct, began pushing for real reform, not just within the HOA but across the city's neighborhood associations. Mandatory transparency portals were proposed, financial audits were written into law, and homeowners were granted new powers to approve or reject major expenditure. These changes were celebrated quietly by the residents, not with banners or speeches, but with the return of things they hadn't enjoyed in years: chalk art on sidewalks, porch lights left on without fear of citation, block parties with laughter instead of tension. Emily Foster, through it all, remained steady. She never sought recognition, didn't flaunt her role in it, and declined public speaking invitations with the same quiet resolve she had used to dismantle Meredith's delusions. She focused on her precinct, expanded training for officers in conflict de-escalation, and spent her weekends gardening, jogging, and waving to neighbors who now greeted her with genuine respect rather than quiet fear. But the final blow from Meredith came in a white envelope hand-delivered to City Hall and marked urgent. Inside was a collection of forged images, crude Photoshop jobs showing Emily in various fake scenarios, drinking with known criminals, vandalizing a wall, and in one absurd image, apparently leading a protest, holding a sign that read "Down with the law." The images were so obviously fake that the city clerk laughed when she opened the envelope, but protocol required her to forward them to the appropriate departments. Emily received a copy inside, not from anger, but exhaustion. She forwarded them to Internal Affairs and to Marcus, who immediately tracked the image metadata back to an IP address once associated with Meredith's old laptop. The twist: that laptop had supposedly been turned in as part of the HOA audit, but serial numbers revealed Meredith had kept the original and submitted a decoy. That was all the DA's office needed. A search warrant was executed on Meredith's off-site storage unit, and what investigators found turned what had started as a neighborhood feud into something that bordered on dystopian fiction. Stacked floor to ceiling inside were boxes of HOA property, unopened mail, surveillance drones, garden tools, and dozens of files containing detailed notes on residents, notes labeled with titles like control risks, emotional instability, flags, and enforcement opportunities. One spreadsheet was titled Priority Disruption Targets, listing names, addresses, alleged violations, and comments like "needs to be watched, talks too much," and in one case, "child frequently runs possible disorderly conduct." The evidence showed that Meredith had not just been a control freak, she had built an entire surveillance operation masquerading as a homeowners association. Emily reviewed the materials in silence, jaw clenched, not with rage but with a deep, cold clarity. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone. Meredith had created psychological profiles on teenagers, labeled elderly residents as quiet threats, and even kept tabs on newcomers to the neighborhood based on how obedient they appeared. The city convened an emergency session, and within days Meredith was arrested and formally charged with fraud, misuse of public funds, illegal surveillance, and falsifying documents. National headlines picked up the story, some calling it the HOA that went too far, others dubbing it suburban surveillance scandal. Meredith, ever delusional, tried to spin the story once again. She appeared on a fringe podcast and claimed to be a whistleblower, alleging that Emily had led a deep state-style takedown of a legitimate community leader. What she didn't realize was that the podcast's editor was a former mentee of Emily's from a law enforcement training program, and after recognizing her name, he turned over the unedited recording to investigators. In it, Meredith admitted to falsifying records and encouraged listeners to form neighborhood defense units to resist future reforms. That was enough to trigger a federal inquiry into HOA oversight on a larger scale. But back home, the transformation was remarkable, with Meredith legally barred from holding any civic position and her face becoming the symbol of authoritarian HOA abuse. The neighborhood rebuilt itself. The new HOA board converted her former community enforcement office, a small windowless room where she had summoned residents to lecture them about weeds or wind chimes, into a community resource library. It now offered materials on homeowners' rights, conflict resolution, and even held monthly seminars on respectful governance. Emily was asked to cut the ribbon at the opening but politely declined, attending quietly instead and slipping out before the speeches began. That was always her way: serve without seeking credit, lead without demanding loyalty. But her influence was everywhere. Children drew chalk murals of unity on the sidewalks. Neighbors who once avoided each other out of fear of HOA snitching were now organizing potlucks and movie nights. The healing was slow but real, and it had Emily's fingerprints all over it. And yet, even as the town moved on, Meredith's grip on chaos didn't let go so easily. In the mail one day arrived a letter from Meredith's lawyer notifying Emily of the liquidation of assets. Meredith's house had been repossessed. Her car, electronics, even artwork had been sold to pay back. misused HOA funds. Attached to the notice was a list of items, and at the bottom, scribbled in shaky handwriting, was a final note. Drone damaged with regret. No signature, but Emily recognized the handwriting. She didn't say a word, just folded the letter and dropped the drone into a tech recycling bin at the next community drive. She wanted no souvenirs from that chapter. As the weeks passed, Emily resumed her peaceful routine, jogging the same route with the same holstered sidearm. Only now people didn't just wave, they clapped. One elderly man saluted her from his porch. A teenager who had once been fined by Meredith for reckless skateboarding handed her a handwritten thank you card with a doodle of a superhero badge on the front. Inside it read, "Thanks for proving one good person can stand up and change everything." Emily smiled, nodded, and gave the boy a high five before continuing her jog beneath the golden morning light. The wind soft and the air free from the weight it once carried. The fallout from Meredith Franklin's removal rippled through the neighborhood like a long overdue storm clearing stagnant air. But just as the residents began to exhale and let themselves believe it was finally over, Meredith made her most outrageous move. Yet she filed a lawsuit against Emily Foster, personally, alleging defamation of character, emotional distress, and unlawful intimidation by a public official. The very idea that Meredith would accuse Emily of intimidation after falsely reporting her to 911 and launching a smear campaign was so absurd that Emily actually laughed when she read the summons. Not a mocking laugh, but a deep, tired chuckle from someone too experienced to be surprised by ridiculous things anymore. Emily wasn't worried. Her brother, Marcus, a seasoned civil attorney with a specialty in defamation law, reviewed the documents and nearly spit out his coffee. "This thing reads like a Facebook rant that someone tried to turn into a legal motion," he said, flipping through pages. "I've seen parking tickets written with more legal substance." Emily gave him the green light to handle it and went back to her job like nothing had changed, while Marcus began preparing a response so thorough it would make Meredith regret ever learning the word lawsuit. Meanwhile, big changes were unfolding. Inside the HOA, with Meredith officially removed and the board under interim leadership, a full audit of past decisions was underway. Every questionable fine, every suspicious vote, every policy Meredith had pushed through without proper procedure was being scrutinized. Transparency became the new mission. The board launched a digital portal where every decision and vote would be logged publicly. Monthly meetings were streamed live. Residents who had once been fined for things like visually disruptive recycling bins were receiving apology letters, and in some cases, refunds. The mood shifted dramatically. People who used to avoid board meetings began showing up, not out of fear but curiosity. Yet, not everyone was ready to move on. A small, vocal group of Meredith loyalists began stirring trouble. They showed up to meetings with folded arms and sour expressions, posted cryptic messages on Facebook, and whispered about Emily being too powerful, suggesting she had orchestrated a hostile takeover. Emily didn't respond. She kept her focus on her duties, her integrity, and the truth. But Meredith, true to form, escalated again. One night, residents across the subdivision awoke to find anonymous flyers shoved under their doors. The flyers were crude, filled with loaded language and inflammatory claims. They accused Emily of being a rogue officer with a personal vendetta and suggested that the new HOA board were puppets of law enforcement. It even listed suspicious behaviors to report, like wearing tactical gear while jogging or unloading groceries with a holstered firearm. Most neighbors rolled their eyes. But one anxious newcomer actually called the police after seeing Emily at the grocery store with her sidearm. The responding officer happened to be one of her former academy trainees and, embarrassed, knocked on the door, explained the call, and apologized profusely. Emily didn't flinch. She filed an incident report and added the flyer to her growing file of harassment documentation. She had reached the point where she wasn't just enduring Meredith's behavior, she was methodically documenting every single piece of it. Then came the city's financial review of the HOA under Meredith's reign, and the findings were damning. More than $75,000 was unaccounted for, much of it categorized under community safety enhancements, which included payments to a security contractor with no valid license, no office, and no insurance. It was likely a shell company Meredith used to redirect HOA funds. When confronted, Meredith went full conspiracy theorist. She claimed Emily had rigged the audit and that the city was out to destroy her for knowing too much. Her attorney, clearly exhausted, tried to maintain professionalism in court but couldn't defend the numbers. Then Marcus, Emily's brother, dropped a bombshell. Through legal discovery, he obtained a group chat Meredith had created with select board members and close allies labeled Community Preservation Task Force. The chat logs revealed Meredith mocking Emily by name, referring to her as Badge Barbie, and writing lines like, "We can't let her badge protect her, she has to go." The logs included strategies for targeting Emily's reputation, and even discussed potential smear campaigns. When the judge reviewed the logs, he openly questioned the integrity of Meredith's claim. "Ms. Franklin, are you aware that knowingly filing a false defamation claim can carry its own legal consequences?" he asked during one hearing. Meredith stuttered. rambled something about free speech, and her attorney immediately asked for a recess. They never filed a continuation. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice before the week was over, but Meredith's behavior continued unraveling. She began showing up uninvited at community events, not as a participant but as a lingering, pacing presence along the sidelines. At a town-sponsored picnic, she arrived with a megaphone and began ranting about corruption, cover-ups, and drones spying on her. Parents quickly moved their kids away. A city marshal approached her and asked her to leave. She refused, citing First Amendment rights. But she was reminded that the park had been reserved for an official city event and her presence was considered disruptive. She was escorted away, once again caught on camera, and once again shared in the neighborhood group chat where someone captioned the video Karen's Greatest Hits, Volume 3. At this point, Meredith had become a meme, a cautionary tale. But Emily didn't let her guard down. She began receiving emails from anonymous addresses, some vaguely threatening, some bizarre. One accused her of organizing a coup to control all HOAs in the state. Another warned she would be judged by a higher authority. One message slipped up and included a sender's signature, Meredith's former treasurer, also her ex-boyfriend. That was enough for Emily to secure a restraining order, which was granted in under 48 hours. Still, she refused to be rattled. She used the experience to push for new training programs at the precinct on how to deal with HOA abuse, false reporting, and neighbor conflict escalation. Her story resonated across the city. It was no longer about one woman with a grudge. It had become a blueprint for how to expose corruption with documentation, patience, and professionalism. Meredith disappeared from public view soon after. Her house sat dark for weeks. Her car vanished. Rumors swirled until it was confirmed. The property had entered foreclosure. She had defaulted on multiple loans, including one backed by misappropriated HOA funds. Her grand plan of building a private security empire had collapsed. The neighborhood, once shackled by her rule, began to breathe. Emily resumed her morning jogs, holstered firearm and all, with neighbors now waving and even saluting her as she passed. She had never asked to be a symbol, but that's what she'd become, not through force, but through restraint, resilience, and unshakable calm. She didn't crush Meredith. She outlasted her, exposed her, and reformed everything she had broken. The most powerful part, she did it all without ever raising her voice. In the days following the false 911 call that brought the neighborhood's tension to a boiling point, the entire block felt like a beehive. Freshly kicked neighbors whispering, side-glancing, speculating whether Meredith Franklin's grip on the HOA was finally starting to slip. For years, her passive-aggressive flyers and selective rule enforcement had been an undercurrent of stress. But calling the police on Emily Foster, the police chief no less, had shifted everything. The once silent majority began to stir. People who'd been fined for things like unsightly recycling bins or holiday wreaths, overstaying their welcome, started openly questioning Meredith's authority, realizing that her leadership was more about personal control than community harmony. But Meredith didn't retreat. Instead, she escalated. A glossy, full-color HOA newsletter appeared in every mailbox 2 days later, dramatically titled "Restoring Safety and Decency to Our Streets," with a lengthy and exaggerated account of the incident. In it, Meredith painted herself as a terrified civilian who narrowly escaped a potential tragedy involving an armed stranger. She described Emily only as a woman affiliated with law enforcement, carefully avoiding her name while still implying something sinister. She even accused Emily of being visibly armed and emotionally unstable, a wild and baseless claim that would have been laughable had it not been distributed under the official HOA seal. The letter was offensive not just for its content, but for its timing. It arrived the same week Emily was scheduled to speak at a citywide public safety summit. What Meredith hadn't anticipated was that several of her neighbors, disgusted by the newsletter, forwarded copies to the city council and even the mayor's office with handwritten notes that read things like, "Is this where our HOA dues are going, and does this woman speak for all of us?" The backlash was swift. At the summit, standing under the auditorium lights in front of state officials, city leaders, and journalists, Emily remained composed. She didn't raise her voice or speak with drama. She simply laid out the facts. She presented a timeline of the incident, read the actual 911 transcript, and played a clip of Meredith's call where her voice quivered as she claimed an armed woman was roaming the streets. The audience shifted uncomfortably as Emily explained that not only was she acting entirely within her legal rights, but she had been targeted by an HOA president who knew exactly who she was and called anyway. This wasn't fear, Emily said calmly. It was control, dressed up as panic. When she finished, the room sat silent until the mayor himself leaned forward and asked, "And she knew you were law enforcement?" "Yes," Emily said. "She and I have had multiple interactions. She knew." That sealed it. Within 24 hours, the mayor ordered a review of HOA oversight across the city. The city attorney began digging into the legality of enforcement policies and public records. Requests were submitted for the HOA's history under Meredith's tenure. Meanwhile, a surprising development came from within the HOA board itself. Daniel Webb, the vice president who had long stood quietly beside Meredith at meetings, reached out to Emily privately. He apologized, explained that for more than a year, Meredith had pressured him into silence, routinely bypassing board votes and issuing fines on her own. He said she often called him afterward just to say, "Don't worry, I've already taken care of it," as if he were a formality she had to tolerate. Encouraged by Emily's integrity, Daniel submitted a written statement to the city clerk, admitting that many of the HOA's policies had not been lawfully enacted. Still, Meredith wouldn't quit. She called an emergency meeting at the community center, insisting that she was being targeted by a rogue cop with an agenda. But this time, she was met with something she hadn't seen in years. Longtime residents began speaking up. Mrs. Helen Geller, who had lived on the block for 38 years, stood with a cane in one hand and fire in her voice. "I've seen Emily help more people on this block than anyone else. She helped my grandson when he locked himself out. She once pulled a drunk driver out of my front yard. All you do, Meredith, is send nasty letters and fine people over porch paint." Meredith tried to cut her off, but the room turned on her. Another neighbor held up a printout of the inflammatory newsletter and asked, "You want to talk about safety? You lied to the police and slandered someone in this community. That's not leadership, it's reckless." Meredith's face turned crimson, her usual smirk replaced by a twitching grimace. She accused the group of orchestrating a mutiny, and that was when someone no one could even remember who mentioned the HOA's bylaw about no confidence votes. If 10 or more residents request it, the board must vote immediately, someone called out. And suddenly everyone began counting. Within 5 minutes, there were 28 hands raised. Only 2 people voted to keep Meredith, and 1 abstained. The motion passed, and Meredith, her authority crumbling beneath her, stormed out of the meeting with the same fury she used to deploy on non-compliant patio furniture. But the drama didn't end there. The following morning, Emily received a call from Internal Affairs. Originally, they had decided not to pursue charges over Meredith's false report, but the city's legal team had since uncovered years' worth of HOA enforcement records, all personally signed by Meredith without board approval. Many of the fines had escalated into civil cases, some resulting in liens or lawsuits. The district attorney was now opening an investigation into possible fraud and abuse of power. Meredith responded not with humility but with hysteria. She took to social media, posting long ranting monologues on the neighborhood forum, accusing Emily of weaponizing law enforcement to settle personal vendettas. One post included the line, "You might have the badge, but I have the truth," followed by an emoji of a lion. Most of the replies were sarcastic. One neighbor wrote, "You called 911 on the police chief. Karen, sit down." Another posted a meme of a woman holding a megaphone labeled HOA hysteria with the caption, "When you try to cancel the cop and end up getting audited, still trying to regain control." Meredith filed an official complaint with the city's Public Integrity Board, but instead of validating her grievance, the board forwarded the complaint to the City Ethics Committee, citing possible misuse of public channels for personal retaliation. Around that same time, Emily was contacted by a journalist investigating HOA abuses across the state. She agreed to a quiet off-record interview, explaining everything in clear, non-dramatic terms. The article went viral. Its title, "When the HOA President Tried to Police the Police Chief." The story gained national attention, becoming a case study in what happens when petty neighborhood politics collide with real authority. Meredith, now desperate, tried to contact the same reporter for a rebuttal but backed out when she was told the interview would require a review of the 911 call and meeting records. At home, Emily remained composed. She wasn't driven by vengeance. She didn't need credit or revenge, but I could see she was no longer playing defense. She was building something bigger, something that would not just expose Meredith but make sure no future HOA president could ever abuse power like this again. "Ma'am, step away from the woman and keep your hands visible." Those were the first words Emily Foster heard as she knelt on her front lawn tying her sneaker that morning. Half confused and half amused, she looked up to see 2 uniformed officers approaching with tense postures and hands dangerously close to their holsters, as if she was seconds away from robbing a bank. Calm as a breeze in her joggers and hoodie, Emily slowly stood, her legally holstered sidearm visible on her hip. And one officer's eyes darted from her face to the badge casually clipped to her waistband. When he realized what he was seeing, panic kicked in, not in Emily, but in the officers themselves. One stammered, "Chief Foster." "Wait, you're Chief Emily Foster? Oh my God." And across the street, standing smugly behind a white picket fence while clutching her over-pampered dog and her phone like it was a remote detonator, was Meredith Franklin, the Homeowners Association president and self-appointed ruler of their cul-de-sac kingdom, smiling like she'd just delivered the punchline of a terrible prank. Meredith had no idea that the woman she falsely accused of being an armed threat was not only a resident but also the newly appointed chief of police. This circus hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for months. ever since Meredith secured her third consecutive term as HOA president through an eyebrow-raising combination of absentee ballots and a conveniently timed cookout where she handed out free barbecue plates with "Vote for Meredith" too. From that moment on, she treated the neighborhood like a miniature monarchy, issuing citations for things as petty as lawn grass being half an inch too high or children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. But her latest obsession had been over visible firearms, insisting they made residents uncomfortable. Despite the state's open carry laws and the comfort most neighbors actually felt knowing Emily lived among them, especially after the string of home break-ins last fall. But for Meredith, it wasn't about safety, it was about control, and Emily's existence was a threat to her power. 2 days before the 911 incident, Meredith had marched uninvited onto the Fosters' property while Emily was oiling her garden tools and announced that she'd be fined $500 daily for public weapon display. Emily had looked up slowly, explained calmly that she was off duty, fully legal, and the HOA had no authority to dictate state firearm visibility laws. "That may be true for regular citizens," Meredith replied condescendingly, "but you're law enforcement. You should be setting an example, not looking like you're prepared for a shootout." Emily, ever the professional, smiled faintly and replied, "I am setting an example." Meredith, an example that respects the actual law. That had clearly ruffled Meredith, who left in a huff muttering, "I'll fix this." Apparently her version of fixing it was calling 911 2 mornings later and framing the situation as a public emergency. The responding officers, mortified, after realizing who they were dealing with, stumbled over apologies. Dispatch just said possible armed woman, and the HOA president insisted it was urgent, one explained. Emily didn't lose her cool. "You were doing your job," she replied, "but now I have to do mine." She calmly walked across the street toward Meredith, who looked increasingly less confident as her victim approached. "You knowingly filed a false police report," Emily told her, her voice measured. "That's a criminal offense." Meredith blinked like she was processing every bad decision that had brought her to this moment. "I didn't know it was you," she squeaked. "You weren't in uniform. You could have been anyone with a gun." "Exactly," Emily said. "That's why you don't call in armed threat alerts on people without evidence. You endangered me, your neighbors, and the officers who responded." That night, 6 neighbors showed up at the Foster home carrying brownies, a homemade pie, and a cooler full of soda. "We saw everything," they said in unison. "That woman's insane. What can we do to help?" The outpouring of support surprised even Emily, who never liked being the center of attention. Despite her title, she had always tried to stay under the radar. But now, the community saw her for what she was, a composed, lawful protector with nerves of steel and no tolerance for pettiness disguised as power. Meredith, however, wasn't done. The very next day she released a neighborhood bulletin titled "Unsafe Behavior in Our Community," in which she referred to Emily only as a woman known to be affiliated with law enforcement, claiming that she had been intimidated and made to feel unsafe by the presence of a visible firearm. She didn't stop there. She also insinuated that Emily may have been abusing her position and called for a revision to community rules banning all weapon visibility. Emily didn't take the bait. Instead, she called the city attorney's office and filed a formal harassment complaint, citing false reporting and HOA overreach. She included the 911 transcript and footage from her personal body camera, something she wore even off duty after years of dealing with people who thought law enforcement officers couldn't also be regular citizens. Days later, the city council called a closed-door meeting with Emily. She laid out everything: footage, documents, and even anonymous letters that neighbors had received discouraging them from associating with problematic residents, letters traced back to the HOA official mail account. One council member said aloud, "I thought the HOA just planned block parties and managed the landscaping budget. I didn't know it had turned into a regime." Meredith, meanwhile, was acting like she had one. She hosted an emergency HOA meeting at the community center to propose her new anti-firearm policy and tried to use the 911 call as justification. But this time, the room pushed back. A quiet resident named Glenn, usually silent at meetings, stood and said, "You lied to the police about our neighbor, who happens to be the police chief. You're lucky we're not voting you out tonight." Meredith flushed deep red and tried to pivot, but even her allies on the board were distancing themselves. Her vice president leaned over mid-meeting and whispered something that froze her smile on contact. That was the first real crack in her porcelain facade. But Meredith didn't know how to back down. Admitting she was wrong would shatter the self-image she clung to like armor. So instead, she doubled down. She started calling anyone who might have dirt on Emily, even reaching out to a reporter at the local newspaper to try and leak her version of events. What she didn't know was that the reporter's teenage son had once been pulled from a burning car by Emily 3 years earlier. That phone call went nowhere fast. Emily continued to handle things quietly and methodically. She didn't go public. She didn't grandstand. She let the documentation and the law do the talking. Behind that calm exterior, though, I could tell she was preparing not just for a defense but for a reckoning. One that would turn Meredith's house of cards into rubble, and do it without ever raising her voice.